Welcome to Still Unbelievable, a podcast by Reason Press, where we examine religious claims, especially those made by Christians, and we regularly respond to items that are featured on the podcast Unbelievable. We embrace dialogue, but as skeptical former believers, we will also criticise unfounded claims and unsupported beliefs. Hello everybody and welcome to an episode of Still Unbelievable. This time it's Matthew on his own in the chair, nobody here to assist me today. For those of you who listen to the Skeptics and Seekers podcast, I was on that podcast with David, the regular host there, with a couple of guests whose names may be familiar, Sarah and David, the Graceful Atheist. So the four of us were over on Skeptics and Seekers earlier this week, end of last week. And we were talking about why people leave the church, why there are atheists like myself and the other names I mentioned who have given up on Christianity and have gone full heathen. So we did a couple of hours of episodes on that, if you want to know what it was that I said and the conversations that we had, because those conversations will be referenced in this episode. Go over to the Skeptics and Seekers podcasts and listen to those. And from that episode, I have got on board with me here Teddi. Welcome, Teddi, to Still Unbelievable.
Hi there. How are you? Thank you for having me.
That's fine. Now, Teddi, you and I have interacted before. We did an episode, I think, on Skeptics and Seekers a couple of months ago. Miracles came up in that conversation among a few other things. It got a bit heated and feisty, if I remember correctly. There was a lot of excitement.
We're a feisty bunch, but would we have it any other way?
Well, not everybody likes it that way, and my anticipation is this one will be a much more straight-laced and English episode, shall we say?
Yes.
And we also interact textually on the Skeptics and Seekers discuss boards and the Unbelievable boards, and we've had some feisty conversations on there too. And I'll put my hand up and come straight out with admission. I don't know the best way to describe it. Shall I just say I've been a little bit unkind to you on occasions, calling you a liar on multiple occasions, which you've picked me up on, and possibly other things. So I want to lay all of that to one side. I want to own what I've done. I don't want to hide from it, but at the same time, I don't want to repeat any of that for this episode. So this is going to be a better behaved episode, and I hope a more enjoyable listen to those who don't like the feistiness. So again, welcome to my podcast.
Thank you.
You had some specific feedback from the conversation that I had with David and the gang about people who leave the faith. So I guess the only thing to do is say, shoot. Let's where we go.
And and the reason why I've been wanting to have a conversation like this for quite a while, because sometimes the back and forth on the internet, people misread tone or just the nature of communication by way of email. Being on a board, it largely cuts to the chase, and a lot of nuance is missed out. And so I think that we're going to have a much better time communicating today, and so I'm really glad of that.
Excellent. And I agree.
And I also want to say I think that episode that we're referencing to was extremely important and really quite priceless. But I want to get further into it, because I think that there is a lot more gold to mine for in terms of for Christians trying to retain the members of the flock. And one of the things that we had talked about just in our emails to each other prior to being on the show today is you had mentioned that you felt that doubt is a feature of Christianity and that pastors should embrace and acknowledge that fact. And I agree with you 100%. Nobody can have 100% confidence that God exists. If that person does, or if a person does, they're deluded. And I'm sure I won't get any arguments from you on that. So there is that element of faith. There also is an element of faith in thinking that there is no God. And so these doubts, the Pope, for goodness sakes, has talked about how he has had doubts. Mother Teresa went for many, many years with doubts. And so doubts shouldn't be hidden and buried under the covers. They should have the light of day, because sunlight is, as they say, the best disinfectant for doubts.
Yes, thank you for that. And I would probably, just to pick up on a couple of your points, I would say that when I was a Christian, well, certainly for many of the years that I was a Christian, I would say that I'm fairly sure I would have said I had 100% certainty that there was a God. Obviously, that wasn't true for the entirety of my Christian walk, because at some point in that, doubts did set in, and after a while I walked away. So at some point that certainty would have dropped below 100%. But I reckon there were a good few years there where I would have confidently said I had a 100% certainty. But yes, I want to echo the whole, doubt is important. In fact, I would go even further than that. I would say, if anyone is going to claim a position as truth or as fact, then not only should there be some doubt in that, but that position should be actively questioned and challenged, certainly on a periodic basis, if not constantly.
And everything, many of the scholars and pastors that I have heard and listened to don't come at Christianity from the perspective of blind faith. Many people would advocate that that there is a lot of evidence to support a belief in the Christian God. And so I certainly don't approach it from blind faith. Perhaps when I was a child I did, but it didn't take too long before, you start thinking and you have doubts enter your mind and you listen. And when I was a child, I hadn't heard anything different. I just kind of knew, well, maybe there's a God, maybe there isn't a God, but I didn't know any of the more sophisticated arguments for or against God's existence. But, as we get older, many of us start getting exposed to different ideas, and those can have an impact. And one of the things that concerns me is that sometimes Christians, they have their belief set, and then they start hearing counter arguments, and then that blows up their whole worldview, and then they just stop right there and don't try to dig further. And I will say, I will freely admit, in my discussions with atheists on a regular basis now, which has been, I guess, since about mid-September of last year, you all have presented a great many challenges. And every time I hear these challenges, I don't duck my head under the covers. I don't close my eyes and plug my ears up. You know what I do? I immediately go and start researching them. And I will say the toughest critic that I have found in terms of arguments that I could see would be extremely compelling to Christians that are on the fence or kind of have one foot already out the door of Christianity are many of the arguments that Bart Ehrman makes, and in terms of inconsistencies in the Bible. And some of these inconsistencies that he argues about, when you start digging further and you hear people giving a good counter argument, they're not always what Ehrman cracks them up to be. But all I can say is, regardless of what side one is on, it's important to constantly challenge one's beliefs until one thinks that one has arrived at the truth. And even once one thinks that one's arrived at the truth, if you start hearing good arguments against what you think is true, then it's important to investigate those to be sure that you have, or be as sure as we can be that we have arrived at the truth. And so when I've heard, there's been a whole bunch of arguments that have been made, and I investigated it. I leave no stone unturned. And I've been doing my best just within the time that I have in a given day when I have some free time to look into those. And so, but to share with you, I have found that even with the toughest arguments, when I still dig deep enough, I still honestly come away still seeing that Christianity is the truth. And so I just want to share that. I think it's important to just always keep digging and being open to changing one's mind, or facing those real challenges that others present. So I don't have a problem. I think it's important that people challenge each other's mindsets, and sometimes it gets bare knuckled. Just we all get excited. We all get excited, and because we're all very passionate about this. And if one's going to be passionate about anything, I mean, what's more important than religion and politics? I mean, that's about life. So to me, it's the oddball that's not passionate about such subjects, and there are a lot of oddballs out there. But I think it's great that we all are very much interested in this subject, and that we challenge each other with these ideas.
Cool. Yes, challenge is always a great thing. It's the challenge isn't the issue; it's how we respond. And to the challenge. That's what defines us. So there's a couple of things I want to go back to. I think the context of what I said about doubt, and for those who want to go back and listen to what I said, it's in the part 2 episode that we did over on Skeptics and Seekers, where we talk about what can people in the church do to get us back into the church, if that's even possible. And I think I told the story of somebody who told the story of somebody I know who, when questioning his doubts or taking his doubts to his church leaders, the response was, well, don't read those things that are giving you doubts. And I don't think that's a good response to doubt. I think doubts should be embraced, not buried, because if you bury them, they'll only come back again. And I think it's disingenuous of senior leaders to give that kind of advice to people who are coming to them with a concern. Because if you're a church leader and someone's coming to you with a concern about doubts, it means they're taking them very seriously and they're causing them problems. So to write them off and just say, don't look at that material that's causing you doubts, that's not really going to achieve much. That's not doing anything to address what's going on. So that was really the context of the comments that I said, because I don't think that is an appropriate way to respond to doubts.
And not
Uh,
only that, it's like banning a book. Then you're
yeah,
gonna, book sales are gonna go up. You're gonna draw that person in like a moth to the flame to reading the the
yeah,
anti-religious
yeah,
material. So I couldn't agree more with you that it is just very, very reckless, in my opinion, and just a overall bad idea for religious leaders, for anybody, for parents, just anyone to try to suppress doubt. It needs to be dealt with, and if one doesn't have good answers, if somebody asks about something, you don't have a good answer to it, then just be honest, and then
yeah,
maybe do some research, and then come back to them and say, well, hey, I've read this, and let me. But if you don't have an answer, just get back to them, and just be candid so that you maintain your credibility with the person, as opposed to just saying something or just trying to suppress it. And if one cannot come up with good answers on too many things that strike to the heart of one's belief system, then perhaps one's belief system isn't accurate.
yep. That's fair. I think a point that I would make is the the belief of Christianity actually has built into it a certain level of certainty. You read the letters of Paul, for example, where he talks about the confidence in Christ and the certainty of salvation. And there is lots of language of certainty peppered
Mm-hmm.
throughout the New Testament. And I think Christians read that and they take that on board. And I think that is, yeah, I think that is part of what's going on here. And people don't like the doubt, because if you've got doubt, it means when you're reading the Bible, you are starting down the road of questioning the accuracy, the reliability, and the authority of the Bible. And Christians don't like that, because you're challenging God Himself if you go down that road. So I think there is built within the framework of Christianity an aversion to any kind of doubt, which I think creates the problems which I was talking about. And the other thing is the human psyche likes certainty. We like to know what answers are. And so when you combine the human desire for certainty and the the Christian aversion to doubt, you've got a perfect formula there for people to, quite frankly, make things up when they don't know. And I think that is a very dangerous place to be when what you're talking about is beliefs, and beliefs that have a major impact on the way people behave.
I agree. I agree. Because anybody who has any sense of reason to them knows that we cannot have a 100% certain answer in terms of what happens to us after we die.
Yep.
Is it all end? Does it not? That is, we have to, whichever way we fall, belief in God or not, it requires whatever we believe on that point takes faith, because we don't have a 100% answer. We don't have anywhere close to one. We don't. Let me just put it this way: we don't have a 100% answer. And one of the things that concerns me when you were talking about belief and all of that, it concerns me when I see people have this rigid mindset of, thinking that something can be known to a 100% degree of certainty. We can't prove anything to a 100% degree of certainty, other than perhaps I think, therefore I am. I think that a good standard is maybe a beyond a reasonable doubt standard. And you know what? Truthfully, in life, many times we make decisions based on a far lower level of proof than what is required in terms of beyond a reasonable doubt. And so there are certain questions that science is not equipped to answer. And so for that person that desires, and it's a natural desire to want 100% certainty on something, but we just can't have it. And so and I think it's also a very healthy mindset. I had a philosophy professor in college, in a philosophy class that I took, and the subject of religion had come up, and I was grappling with the Christian concept of God having existed eternally. And I went to my professor afterwards, after class, and I said, I just, I can't wrap my head around that. It seems like there always has to be a beginning. And he gave me, it was Professor Robert Kane, and he's still alive, at least as of about maybe 2 years ago. He gave me some priceless advice, and he said that we have to understand that as humans, our perspective is very limited on things, and there's a whole lot of things that we are just not equipped to understand, and we also don't have access to a lot of information, and so we just have to learn to accept that. And to me, that was a very good answer to that question. I mean, it still didn't answer my question, but I could live with that answer, and I think it's a valid one, because it's like when people get into questions of whether something is possible or impossible, I always fire back, well, how can you know something is impossible? You don't have 100% knowledge about everything. You're not omniscient. So how do you know something is not possible? And we just don't. So we always have to allow for the for anything to be possible. That doesn't, of course, mean that anything is probable, but we just allow for that. And so I think sometimes Christians can be guilty of a certain rigidity that can later on serve to undermine their faith and belief in God.
Okay, I'd like to come back to the science and the conversation subject, and how we know things can be possible and how we can have certain scientific certainty. But I want to stick a little bit back on the faith thing. You said earlier on, I think you said the magic phrase blind faith, and I think I'd like to see if we can find a definition of that we can agree on, and what blind faith actually means, because and there was something else you said as well, which was not believing God takes just as much faith as believing in God, because I want to challenge both of those items. Sure. So blind faith, I want to posit a definition of blind faith, and we can see if we can adjust that to a definition that we agree on. So I would say blind faith is, at its simplest, believing something without any evidence to support it. So I would say that blind faith is something like believing that the earth is flat, or that the earth is the center of the solar system, with the sun orbiting the earth. I would say give those as two examples of blind faith, because they're both positions that are unsupported by any evidence. And anyone who claims evidence for either of those two positions, they're stating their position on an incomplete picture of the knowledge that we have. They're just picking what suits them, but there isn't actually anything that supports them. Or to take it to an extreme, if I was to say that in my garage downstairs I've got an invisible pink unicorn, that's a blind faith statement. There's no way I could prove that to anybody who challenged it. So I want to give that as a picture of what I understand by blind faith: a belief claim which has nothing to support it. And the other thing is about non-belief in God, it has just as much faith as belief in God. I want to challenge anything, and it doesn't matter whether that's about God or whether it's about the flat Earth. Belief and not believing are not opposite ends of a seesaw. They're not equivalent positions. And I'll step off religion to illustrate my point. Let's pick the moon landings. For example, for somebody to say that the moon landings were faked, which there are quite a lot of people who do that, they have come up with all sorts of. Actually, no, that's not really a good example. That really isn't. Yeah, let's go with the invisible pink unicorn in the garage, because I think that's a much better example to you. So I say to you, there's an invisible pink unicorn in my garage downstairs, and I believe that to be so, regardless of how ridiculous that sounds. I believe that. What your position would be?
What do you mean? I've got one in my garage too.
So. No, you can't. You can't go messing me around like that. The game, please. I'm going to reject your claim because it loses my point.
But then your claim would be nonsensical because you say you have one. We digress.
Yes, you're right. You do. You're just trying to mess with my head. So I make that statement and I say that it is my belief. And somebody who hears me say that says, well, actually, I don't believe that you have such a thing. Their position is not a position of faith, whereas my position is. They're not expressing any faith when they're saying to me, I doubt your claim. All they're doing is they're exercising critical thinking, and they're looking and say they can't see anything in my garage. Okay, I did say it was invisible, so that would be true. But they have absolutely no information on which they could confirm or base the existence of such a creature on. And so their statement is, I have nothing which I can use to verify your claim in any way whatsoever. So they're not taking a faith position at all. They're just saying there is nothing there that I can use to validate your claim, so I doubt it. It's not a faith position. It's just a straightforward neutral position of critical thinking, whereas my position would be a faith position. And I would say the belief in God is the same. Someone believes in God is a faith position. Me saying, well, actually, I doubt that because I've got no reference point on which to judge it, is not a faith position.
So I completely agree with your definition of blind faith. Now, let's get into the issue of doubt and critical thinking. Those things are not, hard and fast. And so I'd argue, and I believe this to be true as well. I'm not just arguing it for the sake of arguing, although I'm not above that. But when we doubt someone's claim, and when we're using our critical thinking skills to doubt someone's claim, we are trusting, we are having faith that our critical thinking skills are going to lead us to a true answer. But we don't know that 100%. And, with your pink unicorn story or hypothetical, you being in the UK, I don't know whether y'all have exposure to the children's show called Sesame Street. Is that
I
something?
do. I have had exposure to it. Yeah.
Okay. Well, so Mr. Snuffleupagus is, this is kind of the pink unicorn in action, except he really did exist on the show. It's just that he always happened to walk away every time Big Bird was trying to get people to like, oh, here he is. And then Mr. Snuffleupagus would leave. And so, yeah, everybody there at Sesame Street had an excellent reason using their critical thinking skills to doubt the veracity of what Big Bird was telling them. But it turned out that Mr. Snuffleupagus on the show really did exist and that Big Bird was telling the truth. It was just timing, bad fortune, whatever. But so I do think that when we doubt, uh, doubt is not certainty. Otherwise, it wouldn't be doubt. It's just indicating, well, I don't have enough evidence to cause me to be 100% certain. But we're all in some degree of doubt about just about everything. So it's just we have to, like David Hume would say, let's stack up the evidence and let's go where the best evidence and the strongest evidence leads us to. And so, I just that's how I see it. I think we're always in a certain degree of doubt.
Yeah, I think your Sesame Street story is a good counter to that. The point I would make is the people who are doubting what Big Bird was saying about the Snuffleupagus monster or whatever.
Snuffleupagus.
Yeah, him.
Snuffy for short.
Yeah, Mr. Snuffy Pants. Right. So I think the others, yep, they had justification to doubt what Big Bird was saying. They were wrong. Their doubts and their questioning were wrong. The key point would be from my perspective about someone saying that there's a God is. I'm also saying that, yeah, my doubt isn't certainty. I would absolutely agree with you on that. If someone says to me God's existence, I go, yeah, not so sure, doubt that. I'm not expressing certainty. I'm not expressing a position of certainty. I'm simply saying I don't have the information by which to validate what you're saying. Therefore, I cannot accept it. Therefore, my default position is to doubt it. But that also doesn't mean that I'm closed to my mind being changed. So let's have the magic photograph of God's big toe.
Well, so Neil, can this then fall into agnosticism in terms of if we don't know, then let's just leave it as I don't know, as opposed to falling hard on atheism in terms of there is no evidence or God does not exist. And I know there are some, differences in definitions of atheism, but perhaps agnosticism.
There are varieties of definitions there, and quite often the variety in the definition differs between theists and atheists. Mm-hmm. So I would call myself an agnostic atheist. I can't know that there's a God. They're agnostic. Therefore, I don't believe there is a God. Atheist.
Well, so let me ask you this. When we look at the universe and our current state of knowledge indicates that the universe has not existed eternally. So we either...
Okay, carry on. I'm going to push back on that point, but carry on.
Okay. So with what, seems to be the current state of knowledge, either we've got a choice between, there's sort of this Big Bang theory that just where from nothing came something, or that there was a creator. I don't know. And let's not even refer to God as being the creator, just a creator, whether it's David's aliens or just whatever, whoever is the creator. I don't know that there's another choice. It's either something came from nothing, or there was some sort of an intelligent being or whatever, whatever God is, that spirit, that being. I'm not one that likes to put real rigid definitions on what God is, because I think God is just so much more, kind of like what Dr. Kane said in that philosophy class of mine. I just think that there is so much that we don't know and that we will never know, or even if we did know, we wouldn't be able to understand. And so I cede to that notion that there's, a lot of things that all of us will remain ignorant about. But, the idea that life came from nothing, we have no evidence in this earthly world that something can come from nothing. There's always something, and then there's always, it seems, to be intelligence behind it.
Okay, huge amounts to unravel there, and it is kind of amusing. This is a mild personal amusement here, that often these conversations about the existence of God, they very, very often end up at the beginning of the universe. And my impression of these kinds of conversations is the Christian wanting to claim evidence for God has no choice but to push the direction of the evidence into an area where we have incomplete knowledge, because then in that area of incomplete knowledge, a God can be inserted. Because areas of the world where we have complete knowledge, there is no room, there is no gap in which to fit a God. But where there's incomplete knowledge, that gap exists. So that's just kind of an idle observation to throw out there. But in terms of the beginning of the universe, and where it all came from, where all our matter originated from, if you want to use that phrase, by whence it was created, to use another phrase, we don't know everything about that. It is possible that we might never know everything about that, because getting to beyond that moment of the Big Bang is immensely difficult, possibly even impossible. So there is lots to speculate on, lots and lots of room for speculation. And so it's only understandable that the idea of a God will come out of that speculation, but it by no stretch of the imagination affirms that there is a God, in the same way that it also doesn't affirm turtles on top of turtles or any other idea that people want to come up with. So I think it's also very important to make that point. Now, you mentioned about eternally existing universe. There's a very interesting philosophical quandary to put into about that, because the beginning of our universe, sorry, let me rephrase that. The beginning of the current state of our universe, because that tends to be how cosmologists phrase it, started with the Big Bang. The Big Bang isn't taken necessarily to be the beginning of the universe from which the universe began. It is taken generally to be the beginning of the current state of the universe. It may have pre-existed before the Big Bang in a different form, maybe as pure energy is one example. So this whole idea of something coming from nothing possibly isn't even relevant, because it was simply the universe changing state from one form into another. But one thing is that is time as we experience it in this universe as it exists now, that time began at that point in the Big Bang. So eternally past goes right to the beginning of time, which is that state of the Big Bang, and we can only measure time back to a tiny fraction of a second prior to that. And so our understanding and our concept of time pretty much disappears at that point. So talking in terms of a temporal state before and after the Big Bang is kind of a nonsense. It's an easy sentence to say, but in terms of the physics and the cosmology that goes on there, it pretty much makes no sense whatsoever, because time itself just doesn't exist the same way if it existed at all. And so there is an idea which goes, as soon as you go back to the beginning of time, you're essentially going back eternally. So there's lots of places there and opportunities there for our philosophical understandings of these concepts to match up and pair up with what the science and what the physics actually says. And yet, certainly nothing is certain at this moment in terms of our understanding there, which means it is pointless making any of certainty. So as soon as somebody refers to the beginning of the universe and the Big Bang and all that kind of thing and says there must be a God because nothing can't come out, because something can't come out of nothing, well, those are both statements of certainty which are being applied to something about which we have no certainty.
I agree with you that there is no certainty in that, and I wasn't trying to imply that. What I was just trying to say is that in terms of the the current state of science seems to correlate with that something came from nothing, because what I've read.
Well,
In
it doesn't,
terms
though.
of the
That's what I've just
scripture.
said. It doesn't correlate with that at all, though. That's what I've just been trying to explain. One of the options is that everything in the universe was existing in a different state prior to the Big Bang, and so nothing has been created because it already existed. It just changed state. So the whole idea of something coming from nothing makes no sense under that idea.
I think that it seems like I've read where some descriptions of the Big Bang Theory, and I'm sure there must be alternative versions of it as well. But I've read some where they do refer to it as that was the start of it all. And so, in terms of people or scientists that hold to that theory, then yes. But I reject the idea that we can know with 100% certainty which way it is. We just don't know. We just can't have 100% certainty on any of that. So, but for the people who think that certain renditions of the Big Bang Theory obliterate the idea of God, my point is just that no, it doesn't. A lot of Christians are heartily embracing the Big Bang Theory because science ultimately can only answer questions that deal with the material world. God could have been the one who put the Big Bang into effect, and that's where that's when you're getting into the supernatural realm, and just to think in terms of whether in our experience on Earth, every time we see intelligence, there is someone intelligent behind it that's creating it. It doesn't just, we don't experience intelligent things coming about just spontaneously through, just randomness. And so that's just kind of what I'm getting at.
You'll have to expand on what you mean by that. Do you mean fully formed, intelligent body just magically appearing there, or do you mean humans evolving from bacteria over a course of billions of years?
Well, I mean, in terms of evolution and natural selection, I fully agree with that occurs, but that natural selection doesn't provide an answer to the origin of life,
no, it doesn't.
and or even just the origin of bacteria, and so that's kind of what I'm getting at. But I just my point overall is that there's a lot of back and forth. You have Nobel Prize winners who are atheists, and you have Nobel Prize winners, in the area of science who are also Christian. And so you've got people who have brilliant minds who have found a way to have both belief sets. And the reason why is because science doesn't really contradict atheism or Christianity, because those are belief systems and belief sets and worldviews, and science is not. And so that's why you can have the smartest people in the room go either way with regard to atheism or Christianity. And it just depends on what one thinks is the most reasonable explanation for how life began, how the universe was created, and I think that's where it boils down to. But to bring this back around to the discussion, one of the other points that you had mentioned on that episode where you were on with David and the gang on Skeptics and Seekers, you were talking about how religious leaders shouldn't try to push this, to create this dichotomy between either you're religious or you believe in science, that both can coexist, and neither of them cancel out each other in the least bit. And so, I think that's important for Christians, and I'm well aware that there are plenty of Christians who go to churches that have religious leaders that tend to be very anti-science, and I think that's very unfortunate. I was always brought up to believe that the science answers the question of how, and the Bible answers the question of why, and those are two completely different questions, and one doesn't really infringe upon the other.
I don't entirely agree with that, actually. I think science, I think that very often the how and the why have exactly the same answer. The question is just using different words to ask the same thing, and the answer is the same thing. And I think the attempt to separate those two into two separate questions, saying science belongs to one and the other belongs to religion, is quite disingenuous. And I feel quite strongly about that. And one of the main reasons I feel strongly about that is what we were talking about before, where science has a specific methodology by which you can test and validate claims, and so that's how we work out the way things work.
Sure.
And these are claims that can be tested, validated, and that is how knowledge moves on, and that is how ideas that we thought were true 100 years ago are not true now, because people answered the best way they could. Equipment and experiments have got better. We've learned new stuff, and so those ideas have been superseded by better ideas. And with every science experiment we do, our knowledge bank increases. If we find out that something doesn't work, that increases our knowledge. If we find out something that does work, that also increases our knowledge. Every time we test and check something, regardless of what the answer is, our knowledge bank increases and we get closer to the right answer. Religion doesn't have that process. So when religion tries to make claims and say, yeah, we've got the why answer, and the why is God, and it's because God loves us, etc., there is no process and no methodology that I can use to validate any of that. So I think to try to to do that is disingenuous. And I think I'll even go so far as to say it is the how and why dilemma is used to try to give the claims of religion equal validation to the findings of science, and I don't think that the two are equal at all. So I react quite strongly to that specific suggestion.
No, I with science, and I am very pro science. So, but I do recognize that it has its limitations. And when I give my example, I think that perhaps you will agree with me. For example, I can repeat an experiment 10,000 times. And even David Hume, I think made some sort of a similar example, gave some sort of similar example. You can repeat an experiment 10,000 times, yet that doesn't mean that at 10,001 something might happen differently. So we take it on faith. Now, is it rational and reasonable to assume that it's going to still keep doing it? Absolutely. I'm right behind you on that. But does it mean that it's impossible that at 10,001 something different happens? Well, yeah, it can. I mean, we know just from the process of mutations that occur. Normally things work a certain way, but then you just get a mutation, and then boom. So we might have to agree to disagree on that. I do think that that religion does not in any way interfere with science, because science deals with the material world, and religion is all about the question of, is what's going on in the material world happening by sheer chance, and is it guided by just some random mindless process, or is there some sort of intelligence behind it guiding it? And to me, those are not questions that science asks, because it's is there something beyond this world, this material world, that is guiding the scientific process? That's why, like, when people talk about the God of the gaps, that was when, for example, in ancient civilizations, they see either hear thunder and see lightning, and they think, oh, God must have done that. And then later on, we start to understand the process, the earthly process of thunder and lightning. Just because we understand the process of something doesn't answer how that came to be in terms of the larger scheme of things. Who created thunder? Did someone create thunder and lightning? In terms of through the natural process, or did it just randomly happen? And so, to me, that's still it always will remain an open question that no one can have an answer to with 100% certainty, because the God of the gaps is dealing with when you don't have a naturalistic answer for something, and so then you just say, oh, God did it.
Mm-hmm.
But with Christianity, it's like God is in charge of the whole show, and he has put the naturalistic process into effect. So it's like either you believe that God's running the show or not. I think it's a kind of a binary choice for which none of us can possibly ever hope to have a 100% certain answer to.
Certainly those of us who are alive now, that's probably true. And all I can do really is reiterate the point that I had before. Everything that we do know that we have a certain level of certainty on in terms of how the universe is expanding, or even why the universe is expanding, how planets formed, how humanity came to evolve. All of these are questions that we are very confident on the answers to. We're still trying to work out the details in some cases, but we're pretty confident on the case in so many of them. And the only reason why we can be confident is because the answers that we've got to have been achieved by the entirely materialistic process using the scientific method. There is no
Mm-hmm.
point in any of those descriptions where we've had to go, huh, you know what, we could really do with a god in here to explain this for us, and then suddenly it works. That has never happened in the history of all of our examination of and learning of scientific knowledge. So I feel that I really need to re-emphasize the point of when we go back to the beginning of the universe and how it all started. Yeah, we don't know all the answers, which is even more reason not to posit that there's a God, because we've got no way of validating or confirming the God claim. So it's a pointless claim to make. You may as well not make it, because it doesn't actually get us anywhere. And there's nothing about it that we can test scientifically. So it actually achieves nothing in our understanding of how any of this works. So you may as well just not bother doing it.
Well, okay. Now you mentioned science here in a different capacity, and I I I don't think I made a promise to you, but I will keep my comments on this short, since that's not really the whole subject of this. But uh, I will say that we have a reason to posit whether God exists, because there's the question of Jesus and was he who he claimed to be, and then the issue of the shroud. And to me, that scientific evidence really undergirds the truth of Christianity. And so I I really love, and as I'm sure you know, very strongly embrace the shroud as something that provides an incredible amount of hard scientific and forensic evidence, especially uh, when put together with history, to point to Jesus being credible in terms of what he was claiming, which then points to a God. But one of the things that just I had heard a really interesting example given by John Lennox of Oxford, where he was saying or asking the question, okay, we see and of course, you being British, you'll love this. Here's a tea kettle and we've got water in it and it's boiling. Why is the water boiling? And uh, people will give all these big scientific answers as to what causes water to boil. And he said, well, yes, that is valid. That's a valid explanation. But another explanation for why the water is boiling is because I wanted a pot of tea. And so that's a whole other realm of thinking. And both answers are accurate, but it's a completely different dimension in terms of where you're coming at with the why is it boiling. One is a material explanation, and the other is something that is immaterial. And so that's just why I try to just point to the science and the methodology of science. I'm all for that. I love it. It brings wonderful things to us. Medicines, just lots of progress. I love it. And I don't find not by any stretch of the imagination that it competes with my belief in God. And the greatest scientist, Newton, when he discovered gravity, it didn't cause him to have less of a belief in God. It caused him to have a greater admiration for God's brilliance. And so, so many of the early scientists were Christians, and it was their belief in the intelligent design of things from a God that helped bring about, I think, sort of the whole scientific method in terms of empiricism. So I don't think that we have to pick science or God, and I think that that's such a big factor in, I suspect, especially Christians who go to churches that are perhaps the more fundamentalist type, where maybe preachers are breathing down their necks like, oh, don't go reading those science books. Don't bring up the word natural selection or evolution. And then people can't help but see the logic of science, and then they're like, well, gosh, then God must not exist because my preacher told me that I've got to pick one or the other, and the information is so compelling regarding the logic of science, so I'm out the door. And actually that well, I don't know if you had a response to that, but that was going to cause me to segue into another question that I had.
Okay. Well, let me just pick up some of your points then before you hit me with that.
Yes.
Certainly, the latter part of what you said, I agree with you. And preachers, church leaders, Sunday school teachers, whoever, there's a cautionary tale about how they present their Bible and Christianity to others, because what you said resonates with me, as you're probably already aware. I was brought up to believe as a creationist, to believe in a literal young earth of no more than 10,000 years of mankind created especially by God. And it was a greater understanding of science that made me realize that, okay, these things that I was told were true aren't. And it's a tough emotional place to find yourself in when you're faced with that.
I can imagine.
And so I genuinely tried to rebuild my Christian faith as an acceptor of evolution and what that meant. But the devastating effect that had on what parts of the Bible that I could take literally and what parts couldn't left me with a conundrum of, where do I draw the distinction? How do I differentiate between bits of the Bible which are not meant to be taken literally and bits that are? And it's really quite a difficult thing to do. And so I was out the door, and I've had conversations with people, with Christians, on this very subject, and I've quite often met what I find the very frustrating responses. Well, why is it important to investigate those areas and pair it up against Christianity? If you believe the science says that, and it conflicts with the Christianity, and the Christianity is all about God existing and God loving us and us wanting to worship God, well, that bit about Christianity doesn't need to meet the bit about mankind being evolved. So why do you have to keep bashing them together and causing conflict? Just keep them separate. And that's not satisfactory to me. I can't do that. My worldview needs to be coherent, needs to be able to work together. And if I'm going to, I couldn't live in a Christianity where I had to compartmentalize parts of my Christianity away from my scientific knowledge, because if I let them meet, they would conflict with each other, and that would cause me dissonance. I couldn't live with a Christianity like that. And so that was just another way in which I was out the door. And intelligent design forms part of that. I just couldn't swallow that either.
Well, let me ask you this. Why does it have to be an either or proposition in terms of either the Christianity that you learned through the church or the way that your parents taught it to you, or you read about, the materials that you read? Why is it that Christianity either has to be or take that form or nothing at all? What about, the different denominations? There are lots and lots of differences that exist. What about taking a look at some other interpretations of Christianity where perhaps there's not as much of that tight reading of things in the Bible? And it seems like I need to research this further, but in terms of the young Earth creationists, I think it was John Lennox that had written a book. I haven't read it, but it gets all into Genesis, and he talks about how there was a gap, I think, between the creation of the universe and then the creation of all the other things, and that can explain the age of the Earth being, what science tells us that it is. But he's written a whole book dealing with that particular question, and I'll have to. I'm really curious about it, and I definitely want to find out more about his interpretation. And I'm certainly not one of those young earthers,
Mm-hmm.
but it doesn't have to be either you accept the fundamentalist view on things or nothing at all.
You're right. It doesn't have to be like that. The bad news for the creationists, though, is creationism specifically is generally pushed out as this is the alternative to science, because scientists are wrong, because in order to have a young Earth, you need to interpret the data this way, and that way, and science doesn't. So science has to be wrong. So certainly from the young Earth creationist point of view, there is very much that kind of anti-science stance. But you're right, for many other Christians, evolution, the old universe of billions of years, really isn't an issue, and they have absolutely no problem whatsoever accepting all of those ages, the fact of evolution, and everything else. And I'm very, very glad that there are Christians that do that, but for the reasons that I said before, in terms of compartmentalizing my understandings and my beliefs, there is an element of that. It's still, and I couldn't do that. I needed something that was coherent and worked together. And I am confident in evolution because of the evidential process of it. I am confident in the age of the universe because of the very specific evidential process of it. We have worked out how old the Earth is, we have worked out how old the universe is, and we have worked out how evolution happened by hard work and diligent scientific processes. We weren't given this information by external means and then we confirmed it afterwards. We worked it out, and the knowledge that we've had of those processes has changed over the years, as I hinted at earlier. Mm-hmm. With the claims of Christianity, it just doesn't work like that. It's not something that we've worked out retrospectively and gone, oh yeah, there must be a God because there's this evidence and this evidence and that evidence. It's all ancient documents written down by people who didn't have the scientific knowledge that we have. And it's written down there, and it's got all the hallmarks of an evolved faith of over generations, things being added to it, and it arrived at that point. And now what's happening is Christians are working really, really hard to preserve Christianity in this bubble the way it has been for the last X thousand years or whatever. And it's not evolving with new knowledge. It's not changing with new knowledge, and it's not being confirmed by evidence that we can measure, validate, confirm, and test all the things that we can know confidently through the methodologies of science I explained earlier about age of the earth and universe. So Christianity doesn't meet those standards and criteria. And so when I sat down and I thought, okay, this is the situation. Now I can accept the science story because of that, but when I try to match that same standards of criteria onto what's going on with Christianity and the existence of God, and yes, even the life of Jesus, I can't have the same confidence in it at all. It's like in history books, when we don't have confirmation of what's written in history books, we can only make a best guess of what really happened. Details are very vague in a lot of things, but Christianity expects us to accept some very specific details which we simply cannot know, and so I can't accept it. And so that's kind of, in very short form, obviously the whole process took years, but that's kind of really how I ended up, and I had no choice but to say, if I can't validate it, I can't accept it. If I can't accept it, I can't call myself a Christian.
But no, with the conflict, are you talking about in terms of the age of the earth? Because
no, I don't mean the age of the earth conflicts necessarily. What I'm saying is, I know I'm confident in the age of the earth because of the scientific process that leads up to us understanding how old the earth is, but I can't. When I look at the religious claims of Christianity in terms of the miracles of Jesus, in terms of God existing forever, in terms of those kinds of things,
mm-hmm.
I don't have any process by which I can validate any of it. And if I can't validate it, how can I know it's true? And if I can't know it's true, I can't believe it. And if I can't believe it, I can't be a Christian.
Okay, so in terms of wanting that scientific process to validate it, why then would investigation into the shroud not be an exhilarating thing for you to delve into? Because I can tell you, I first read a book on it when I was 16, and the way it came about was I was probably around Easter time, and a lot of times back then, either on television there would be something about the shroud, or you go to check out the grocery store and one of the magazines has a photo of the Shroud of Turin on it. And so I saw it and I was like, what's this about? And I got curious about it. And I read Gary Habermas's book on the shroud. And I just was so fascinated by the science. I was already a believer, but I really, truly enjoyed having science to back up my belief, and to where, like any natural belief, there's always some degree of doubt in any thinking person's head when it comes to something that can't be proven to a high degree of certainty. And so there was that science, Matthew, behind it. And it's exhilarating to see that all of this whole religion stuff, it's really not a bunch of bunk. When you look at what the historical claims are, we have extra, or non-biblical sources showing that Jesus existed. I mean, even Bart Ehrman debates the Jesus mythicists, and basically says it's You'd have to be a moron to not believe that Jesus existed historically, or otherwise you just can't trust any history. Um, and Jesus made very, very specific claims about himself. And then he made a falsifiable claim saying that if his body was to be destroyed, uh, well, and I think he used the term temple, but that was a metaphor for his body, that he would raise it in 3 days. So then there's the question, did he raise it in 3 days? Is the shroud Jesus? Because if the shroud is Jesus's burial cloth, there is evidence, strong, very strong evidence. As you know, I'm a criminal defense attorney, and I have said this before, and I'll say it again. I know what it looks like to have evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. And I'm telling you, there is evidence beyond a reasonable doubt in the shroud that Jesus was who he said he was. And there's evidence of the resurrection there. So it's beautiful, pure scientific and forensic evidence. No voodoo, no magic, none of that. You have people that are the tops in their field internationally, and the research still keeps going on to this day. And so I just, for someone like you, and I can appreciate that there are a lot of people that need that scientific evidence to help them believe and to firm up their faith, especially if they initially grew up with, in a fundamentalist church, to where it was kind of, you have to pick science or religion. And, if they were brought up to have certain types of really rigid beliefs, and then science starts chipping away at their beliefs, and so then they come to the conclusion, well, then all of this God stuff can't be real. I would just really like to encourage you to just trust me. I mean, maybe we've talked enough to where you don't think I'm just some religious fanatic, because I'm not. I really am not. I just, we all get into debates, and so we then just start presenting our position. And if that, that can sometimes make someone look fanatical, but just, if you would, just trust me. I sent you some of that information in its rough form. Take a look at the hard science from people that were scientists at Los Alamos National Laboratory, where, we make the nuclear bombs and stuff. These aren't flakes. And maybe you will find some of that hard science compelling. And, I don't know. I know that there are lots of famous people. Anthony Flew, who was, probably one of the biggest voices among atheists while he was alive. And he ended up, intelligent design ended up being what turned him around into abandoning his atheism for belief. I think he became a deist, perhaps, as opposed to a theist. I'm not sure. But if he could do that, that's why I do have. I always think that there's always hope that something that atheists might hear might cause them to just take other information into consideration, and maybe that can cause a change of heart and mind.
Yeah, okay. I don't give much time to the shroud, so and we discussed this a bit. I never really took the shroud seriously, even when I was a Christian. So, to be honest, I don't really see how it could get me there. But that aside, the shroud came up when we had our conversation earlier on Skeptics and Seekers last year, however long ago it was. And you know from that exchange that I really don't have a lot of time for the shroud. What I will say is it's an interesting artifact, and I absolutely think it should be studied. I think it should be studied more. I would love to know more about it, love to know how it came about to be made. I would love scientists to be able to have an opportunity to have unfettered access to it for as long as they want, to be able to cut it up if necessary, and to measure and to investigate the tiniest intricacies of it. I have read about it, both the for and against arguments of it, from the invisible mending claims to the blood types to all sorts of other things on it. And the balance, frankly, doesn't really impress me. I have to say, I'm really unmotivated to look at it more, because standing back and look at it, the strongest proponents of it are people who have a vested interest in it being a piece of Jesus, a Christian artifact, and that in itself creates in me a suspicion.
But no, there were plenty of Jews. There were several Jews on the team, and I think it was Alan Adler that was one of the lead scientists on the blood evidence. Was Jewish, so he didn't have a vested.
No, I'm saying the people who are promoting it. I don't say necessarily the people who are on the original team that looks at it. So the people who are promoting it. Sorry, sorry if I wasn't clear. That's what I meant by that phrase. And I am also deeply suspicious of the Catholic Church and its holding of these kinds of artifacts. Now they've got these. They make a lot of money out of people becoming saints, about their healing center in Lourdes and other such places, and about people coming to places to see these artifacts. So I'm deeply suspicious of the motives before you even get to the evidence of it. And I'll give you one kind of example of why I'm just suspicious of claims that the shroud has been studied rigorously. Mm-hmm. Before it burnt down in Notre Dame Cathedral, in amongst the artifacts I've got there was an artifact that was claimed to be the crown of thorns that was placed on Jesus' head. To my knowledge, that crown of thorns has not been placed up against the shroud to see if it even resembles or matches the markings on the shroud that would have come from thorns, because we've got the head there, and we've got, so it's little details like that. I think, really, you want us to believe it, but you can't even do simple experimental tests like that, and so and again, I really don't want to talk more about this than is necessary, because I will become impatient and dismissive because I don't react well to the crowd, to the shroud, because it tends to be talked about enthusiastically, and I don't think it warrants the enthusiasm that it takes.
If I may, with the crown of thorns in Notre Dame, it seems like it's been a while ago that I read this, so forgive me that I don't remember the specifics, but the stuff that I've read about it seems to indicate that it probably is not the crown of thorns. So I haven't read anything compelling about that. So just as an FYI,
and I would agree with you. And there's another Catholic church which has also got one of the original nails from the cross, and possibly even a piece of wood from the cross. There was a time in history, probably around about the time of the Crusades, but somebody can fact check the dating on that, where these kind of artifacts made lots of money, and they suddenly started appearing. And and so why can't the shroud just be one of those? Yes, it's quite fantastic.
Well, the shroud, in the image, and there have been lots of shrouds floating about, especially during those medieval times, when the real shroud, I would say, first appeared. Yes, there's no question. You certainly will not get a dispute from me that there were forgeries. But of course, just because there are forgeries doesn't mean that there isn't still a shroud, and that the actual genuine shroud of Jesus might not still exist. And when we had gotten to the miracle episode that we were on together, it's not a God of the gaps argument to say that that the shroud points to a miracle. It is because we are looking at the material evidence that we have every reason to believe that this is an otherworldly creation. They still can't figure out how it was made. And so it's positive evidence, not negative evidence, that warrants the belief in its being genuine and that it is an actual miracle. But anyway, I know that that's not the subject of this episode. And actually, if I may, there was something that you had said on that Skeptics and Seeker episode. I believe it was you that said that, and please correct me if I'm wrong on it. I thought that you had said something about how eliminating doubts is not necessarily enough, or defeating someone's doubts about God's existence doesn't solve the problem of Christians. And I don't know if you meant leaving the church or leaving or beginning to disbelieve in God.
I remember some conversation about that phrase, and I think you're probably remembering the phrase accurately. Although it may have been me. I can't honestly remember, and I'm desperately trying to remember the context in which that was, because pulled out the way you phrased it and hearing it like that, it seems an odd phrase to make. So there was clearly some context around that, and you'll have to forgive me. I don't remember the full context.
I think the context was because I was taking notes as I was listening to the episode, because I was very much so wanting to delve deeper into some of these things. Part of it had to do with just what was going on in the church and abuses in the church, and how I believe you had made the statement that let's see, where was it? That basically that abuse in the church is a good reason to walk away. And I don't know if you meant from Christianity or just from that particular church. And so
Okay.
I think that maybe those kind of tied in. I was wanting a little bit more clarity on that.
Okay, yeah, possibly. Okay, let me try. Certainly on the abuse front, I think probably if I didn't say it, I probably meant it, because it's the sort of thing I would say, is that in an environment like a church where abuse might happen or in the past has happened, and somebody is hurt by that, and people have been and people are being, and that's part of the reason why I do what I do, because those people need somebody to speak up for them, is that is a good reason to certainly to leave that church. Because if you're in an environment, and I don't care whether it's a church or whether it's a camera club or a school or your place of work or whatever, if there is abuse going on in that situation, then the most obvious thing is get out of that situation, and that in and of itself doesn't doesn't mean that you should then become not a Christian or not a photography enthusiast or whatever. But I think the charge that I would make is the the environment of religion enables people who are abusive to take positions of control and power and become abusive and
Yes.
to trap people into that. And so this isn't so much about protecting people from abuse, but criticizing a a situation, a position, a structure, a hierarchy, which gives absolute authority to individuals and enabling them to be abusive. And then to go one step further, that same hierarchy has, you know, presumably to save face for itself, because the whole point of Christianity and the hierarchy within that is to be a better place for society, to be a better place for the world. You know, come here, receive your forgiveness, receive your salvation, you know, and be loved by God who has created you. That is part of the essence of what it is to be a Christian and to be a Christian leader. And it, if true, it's a wonderfully beautiful thing to gift to mankind. But the that whole structure and that whole system not only has enabled abuse, but has then actively covered up and protected abusers, because it's too embarrassing to throw those people out and to prosecute them, because it makes it look just like another corrupt human organization. So that's my specific charge at the church, and the church really needs to do something about that.
I
And
I'm with
some
you.
parts
I'm
of the
with you.
church and some parts of the church are worse at it than others. I will quite happily say that. I'm not saying every church in Christianity is like that, but I would say that there are enough churches in Christianity that are like that, that the Christian claims of the transforming power of the Holy Spirit are doubtful, because when you see that much abuse going on in churches, you don't see the transforming power of the Holy Spirit at work in people. So that's a justification, as far as I'm concerned, to doubt that the Holy Spirit exists and changes people to behave better.
Okay,
So
well,
that's kind of it unpacked. That's in a nutshell. I hope that made
so
sense.
well, and that reminds me of Austin Powers. No, this is me in a nutshell.
Yeah.
so, um, so what about okay with the Holy Spirit? Because I remember you mentioning something about that, not on the show, but uh, privately through our emails. The transformative power of the Holy Spirit. Let me pose this question. Perhaps that bad actor does not have the Holy Spirit in them. Perhaps they are a wolf in sheep's clothing, or perhaps they're just like the rest of us Christians, still guilty of vile, sinful behavior. And that's why we are in need of someone to redeem us. But beyond that, I agree with you uh, at your anger at churches where abuse goes on and that abuse is swept under the rug. I that incenses me. One, just because it's horrific that they're doing that, and two, because it paints Christianity as just in a light that it doesn't deserve to be in. It reflects poorly upon it, and even though Christianity needs to be judged by its tenets, we as humans can't help but look at people who profess to be Christians, and when we see them behaving poorly, it makes Christianity not look so great. So I agree with you there. And what about the idea, instead of leaving the church, what about a rebellion against that? I mean, mutiny. What about the people, the congregation, rising up in the same way that the Christians, the anti-abolitionists, or the abolitionists were in America, and we ended up having a civil war over it. To me, there needs to be sort of a civil war situation going on within the Catholic Church to clean house from all of the people that see abuse and just move these priests onto other congregations that don't know about their evil deeds. And you know, instead of leaving, why not clean house? And it took a civil war to get rid of slavery in America and to make things better in that respect. And perhaps that also needs to happen in the church, because where there is power, we will always see corruption. I mean, we see corruption among people without power, but once you start getting power, then you tend to see even more of it, or it goes unchecked. And so, maybe the answer isn't leaving, but especially if it's something like sexual abuse, bringing in the authorities when people suspect that's going on. All I know is, for example, the state that I live in the United States, if anybody has good reason to think that somebody is being sexually abused, like a child or an elderly person, it's actually a crime to not report it. And I think that's a really great law. Now, you have to be careful. You better have good reason to think somebody's doing that before people start calling the police. But it forces, or doesn't force people, but it encourages people and subjects them to the possibility of criminal charges if they have good reason to think that's going on, or they know that that's going on, and they stay silent. Because when we stay silent with regards to things like that, we have blood on our hands for the next victim of that perpetrator. And so I think it's incumbent upon all of us, when we see that sort of thing going on, that we do our best to fight it.
I completely agree with you there. I'll just give you a quick anecdote from my past. About 20 years or so ago, I used to do a lot of youth work at a regular summer camp. And as one of our roles as a leader on that summer camp is, there were a small number of the young people on there that we would be responsible for. So if they had an issue, be it a spiritual issue or a problem at camp or something like that, they would come to us. And if it needed feeding up the leadership chain, it would be our responsibility to see that was dealt with. And we're also encouraged that during the course of the week, we would have a one-on-one chat with those young people who were our responsibility, say about an hour, maybe an hour and a half, whatever. Just to see how they were spiritually, any issues, how they were at home, and just to kind of not really an assessment of them, but just a one-to-one with them, counselling light, I suppose, but we weren't trained at counselling. But one thing that was absolutely made clear to us when we were leaders and at the beginning of the camp, and when we were talking with these children, that if they told us something, it was in confidence, we shouldn't break the confidence. But if they revealed anything to us that came under the category of abuse, we were under absolutely no uncertainty that this had to be reported. And if they started telling us something like that, we would have to stop them and say, if you carry on telling me about that, say, have to stop them and say, this is abuse, I am obligated to report this. You cannot ask me not to tell anybody about this. I have to, by law, go to the leadership and tell them what you've told them. So if you want to tell me this, know that I have no choice but to go on and report
that's
change.
That's such a bad policy, in the sense that you shouldn't have to tell the person that you're about to, report on it, because then that's a chilling effect on the person continuing on telling you that you should. I agree with the part about reporting it, but that whoever created the idea or the policy that you need to inform the person that's spilling the beans, because that's just going to shut them up. So
possibly it would shut them up, but I think it's because if you're going to report something on, you need to let the party know that it is being reported on. You can't not, because if you report it on without telling them, then they lose trust in you. So regardless of what happens next, there is some negative side effect. Either they lose trust in you, or they become slightly demotivated in telling it to. But if they've come to a point where they're considering telling you or starting to tell you anyway, and then you say, I need to report this up, they already know that they're with somebody who's in safe hands. So I understand your concerns. I still support that policy, because I think on balance it's better to tell on. But that wasn't really the point of this anecdote. The point of this anecdote is 20 years ago it was being drummed into me and other people and Christian youth leaders around this country that anything that sounds like abuse that a young person tells you must absolutely, in all circumstances, no exceptions, be reported on, because it cannot be covered up and it must be dealt with. So that's the point of the story at which I'm trying to say. So in terms of churches where abuse has been covered up, people moved so that the rumors no longer exist, and all this kind of thing, just to quash this kind of revealing of horrendous acts. But it's kind of a question to you to get your, what are the sanctions that should be made on a church? That should the individual church congregation be disbanded? Should the church hierarchy have some kind of tougher punishment? If you were in government and had the power to punish a church for allowing this kind of abuse, is it good enough for the guilty parties to go to prison? Should those who were responsible for covering up, are they guilty of a greater crime? Should they have more time in jail?
Oh yeah, I'd nail every last one of the people that knew, especially people in authority, but honestly, even, kind of like I said, with the state law that we have, adults that know and do nothing, I'd punish all of them, because it is wrong to be aware that somebody either is actively being abused or has been abused, and that their abuser has not been brought to justice, because that abuser is just going to keep making more victims. And that is a little bit of a side issue, but it's still connected. For example, for people who have been raped, as difficult as that, I'm sure, is to come forward about it, especially if they're concerned about possibly not being believed, there is a moral responsibility to that rape victim to report, because the likelihood is that rapist is going to do that to someone else. And there is, and I hesitate to even say this, just because I don't want to pile on to rape victims who haven't come forward, but and that's not my intent. But the reality is that rapists it's not usually a one and done thing. And so
Yeah.
when they go on raping, if somebody had blown the whistle on them, then perhaps all these other rape victims would have never been victimized. So sometimes life puts us in these difficult positions where, yes, is it going to be painful? Is it difficult? Sure, it is, and I don't mean that lightly. I mean, I can only attempt to imagine how hard that would be, and I don't really have to imagine that hard. I'm a criminal defense attorney. I see that sort of stuff. I know that it's hard, but sometimes we have to do things that are difficult. Was it difficult for Germans in Nazi Germany to risk their lives hiding Jews in their home? Sure it was. And they were risking not only their own lives, but the lives of, if they had children in that home, they were putting their own children's lives at risk. Sometimes doing the right thing can be really hard to do, but we have to do it. And so in terms of with abuse in the church, whenever we see it or even get a sense that that's going on, it has to be dealt with, and not just internally. I mean, that's a matter of the state. And speaking of which, my son is part of a choir, and they recently started having some of the little practice sessions at a church. We're not parishioners at that church, but a very interesting thing. And I was thinking to myself, bravo. They have a policy that anytime kids are present, there always has to be several, more than one adult in a room if there's going to be, a child present. And I think that's a great idea, a great policy, and to also impress children with the knowledge that, hey, don't ever be in a room with an adult, at church or and probably other places too, by yourself, because you could be, maybe impress upon a kid like you'd be breaking the church rules and you don't want to break the rules, or or that adult is breaking the rules, so you don't want to, even if, let's say, it's a good adult that's not trying to do something bad, well, hey, you don't want to get that adult in trouble by being in that room with them by themselves. So just be sure you are never, in a room. And I was like, well, that's a fantastic idea. And it's such a basic idea. I don't know why every church doesn't do that. But well, what business anyway does somebody at church need to be in a room alone with a kid? Where are the parents?
At home enjoying Game of Thrones or whatever. As someone who has a teenager at home, when there are times when they're out of the house with friends or whatever it is they're with, and it's nice for the grown-ups to be at home without the brats being around.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. My son's about to turn 12, so almost a teenager. But
The joyous years of answering back and girlfriends and all sorts.
Yeah, so it's like, just but especially with these, usually teenagers have a little bit more of their wits about them. I think it's these younger children that concern me in terms of being in a room with, anybody who's in a position of power. And we see this in politics too, and in the workplace. So, it's a sticky situation, but it's one that people shouldn't turn a blind eye to. I was going to ask you, uh, when we talk about, you had mentioned something about the Christians who don't care about other Christians who leave the church. And I guess you were seeing evidence of this, I presume, or I mean, I guess so. I would imagine.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how many of them truly exist. I suspect there's not a huge number, and they tend to be, I would say, that the more fundamentalist wing of Christianity tend to be like that. You know, if they're not Calvinists, they're certainly relatively close to that branch of Christianity. Certainly, most Christians, and certainly the Christians that I know personally, when I've said to them, you know, especially those that knew me when I was a Christian, you know, they're disappointed. You know, the most common response I get from Christians now, say caring Christians, when I say I'm no longer a Christian, I don't believe anymore. You know, they'll say, I'm sorry. You know, that saddens me. I'm genuinely sorry to hear that. You know, there is definitely a compassion that comes across, but there are some who are not like that. And I think I gave the example in the conversation that I had with the guys last week on Skeptics and Seekers, where on the Unbelievable Facebook page, where Justin or whoever it was posted the link to the story that Rhett and Link, the YouTubers, had talked about their deconversion, and somebody who fits the description what I was describing said, well, sometimes it's better just to shut the door behind them. So that kind of attitude does come across. And the other kind of attitude that I get, and you'll be amazed how often I see this, but it is always online. I've never had a single person say it to my face, is there can't have been real Christians to begin with. And there's no sense of compassion that comes out of statements like that. It is instant judgment and zero compassion. And so that bothers me, because again, going back to what I said earlier about, you know, the alleged transforming power of the Holy Spirit, well, you just don't see it in that kind of response from Christians.
Right. And you know, I I don't know that I would ever think that, oh, well, they just weren't real Christians. I think that worst case scenario, perhaps in some, not in all, perhaps the roots weren't as deep. But I can see, I mean, having interacted now for a number of months with atheists, uh, there are a lot of very strong arguments that they bring up. And so I could see how someone could listen to those arguments and then that really shake their faith. And my only response to that is that if you continue to dig, you will find at minimum, arguments that are just as potent in the opposite direction. And in my opinion, a lot of times even better. But you have to be willing to dig. And by that, I'm not trying to say that Christians who have left the faith and become atheists, that they haven't done their homework or whatever. I'm just saying that there is information out there. You know, Ehrman, I would say, is probably the biggest ringleader in terms of trying to do damage to people's faith. And the interesting thing is, he kind of argues out of both sides of his mouth. Actually, one minute he said that the inconsistencies that he sees in the Bible were not the reason why he left the church, that it was over the issue of suffering. But then he'll say other times where it seems pretty clear that the inconsistencies did play into it. So I'm not sure what the correct answer is. Maybe it's a little bit of both. But in listening to a debate with him and James R. White, I thought that it took somebody like James R. White, who has the same type of credentials, like in textual criticism, as Ehrman does, in order to really be on the same playing field. I mean, sometimes Ehrman would debate with other people who were big in Christianity in terms of being big scholars, but they're not textual critics, and so Ehrman was kind of getting them on the ropes at times. But when Ehrman went up against somebody with his same type of credentials, I felt that it was a lot of times leaning a little bit more towards the Christian. But at best, it was like a tie. But I kind of felt like it weighted a little bit more in favor of the Christian. But I think that preachers, especially if they feel that they have members of their congregation who are looking at some of the more sophisticated arguments against Christianity, maybe these preachers do need to get up to speed on the things that Ehrman and company tend to espouse.
Yeah, I don't have a lot of time for arguments and specifically debates, and the reason why is there's a wonderful mantra, and I'm not the only person who uses it, but there's a wonderful mantra that goes, arguments are not evidence, and that's basically where I live on that one. Yep, there are people out there who make wonderful arguments both for and against Christianity, and there are people who become utterly convinced by those arguments. And me, I'm a facts man. Give me something I can touch, feel, measure, handle, fondle. I don't care how great, how beautiful, how succinct, how long, how convincing anybody's argument is. I don't even care who they are. All I want to know is, what have they got that supports that argument that I can validate?
I agree with you. I'm not in disagreement with you.
Yeah, good. And if they haven't got anything, then why should I pay any attention to the argument, no matter how good it is? So that's basically the position that I take on that. So I don't give a lot of time for arguments, and I certainly have very little interest in debates either. I've had these kinds of conversations with someone, and people have said to me, "Oh, go and watch such and such a debate where William Lane Craig was talking with so and so," and for the reasons that I've just said, I go, why should I? What's the point? What's the evidence? Or I'll make a comment on someone's post, and they'll say, "Well, did you watch the video?" And I'll say, "Well, what evidence is there that's presented that I can measure and validate?" Because if there isn't, why do I need to watch the video?
Well, in terms of like the evidence, in terms of, for example, especially if one holds to the inerrancy of the Bible, if one sees contradictions, then it's like, oh gosh, so this is all baloney. And so by having a debate over that, it helps to clarify things, because some things aren't, for example, we can't judge history by science. It's just a different area, and we have to look at a different type of evidence and understand in terms of and I agree with you. I'm not going to dispute in terms of, if you're going to believe in a worldview, uh, especially a worldview that impacts your behavior, that you want some evidence for it, and you want some really good evidence for it,
Yep.
especially if it impacts your behavior in a big way. And for example, if someone is gay, well, gosh, then the evidence for it really, really matters.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't fault um, them for saying, hey, before I even consider whether I'm going to have a change in lifestyle, show me the evidence and let me weigh it. It, and then there's also the argument of, well, homosexuality is just part of a laundry list of a bunch of other sins, with adultery, with uh, coveting things, with gossiping, with theft. I mean, I don't. I know that people seem to want to constantly elevate homosexuality and sort of isolate it as just this extra big sin. Well, there are a lot of big sins, and you don't have to be gay to be committing them. And and there's the question of, did the writers of the different books in the Bible, how much did the culture that they were in play into what they were writing? I mean, I trust that the books in the Bible are the inspired word of God. Uh, whether I will call them inerrant, I don't know. You know what? I'm gonna say I'm agnostic on that point. I don't know how pinpoint accurate every single little thing in the Bible is. I know that there are lots of books that didn't make it into the Bible because they weren't viewed as being credible enough to warrant being put into this compilation that we call the Bible. So I'm not going to say that I trust it 100%. And you had brought up in that Skeptics and Seeker episode in terms of how the church deals with homosexuals. And I'll tell you, I have no respect for any church that that does anything to treat homosexuals or anybody else badly. And part of what tolerance is all about is you don't have to agree with something in order to still love somebody and care about them. And I don't think, one of the things that I have seen people do, friends of mine, we see it in daily life, where someone will alter their worldview in order to conform with their desires, in order to affirm their desires. So, for example, to throw in another hot, incendiary topic, abortion. A woman has been, let's say, pro-life all of her life. She finds herself unexpectedly pregnant, and all of a sudden she's pro-choice, just because she wants to be able to justify having an abortion. And sometimes we need to be adult enough, courageous enough, intellectually honest enough to be able to admit that sometimes we are going to choose to do something that isn't what we really think is the right thing to do, but we're still going to do it anyway, and just let the chips fall where they may. And look at all the people that engage in premarital sex and that are still going to church and all that. Well, that's right up there. That's in the same category as being a homosexual, but people don't focus on that. And I think that's wrong, to single out homosexuals. We all we all fall short in one way or another. And what we have to do, what we are commanded to do, is to love each other, to care about each other. And that doesn't mean we have to affirm everybody's behavior if we don't think that that's what God wants us to do, or if we just on a personal level just don't agree with what somebody's doing. But that doesn't mean we should treat them badly. So I just wanted to kind of give my 2 cents on that, because I know that from what you were saying, that it bothered you, as it bothers me when you see people of the LGBTQ community being treated poorly by the church.
Yeah, it does. And we've just rolled over 2 hours and you've managed to touch probably the two biggest hot button topics in Christianity. So, but yeah, time's moving on, so I won't touch those topics. It's probably quite easy to guess how I feel about homosexuality and abortion. But yeah, I'm not going to propose we go there. I just have one question for you before we hit into the roundup, and that question is about the whole thing about these people were never really a Christian. If we were in a scenario where somebody was throwing that accusation at me, would you come to my defense?
I would.
Thank you. That was nice and easy.
No, I mean, I don't doubt that you believed. I might rile you up a little bit right now. I still have to wonder if there is still some belief in you, and if perhaps some of the things that were going on with the church, if maybe there's sometimes a difference between being anti-church versus disbelieving in God, and that sometimes that can really look like the same thing. And I don't know that there's anything that you can do to convince me to where I'm just like dead certain. I think that there's, let's just put it, a reasonable chance that there still might be something in you that acknowledges a God. I might be wrong. I do believe that you are a believer, and I still think there's the possibility that there is still more than a kernel of that still within you, and maybe that kernel can turn into something else. I might be wrong. But I hope, and if Anthony Flew could change, then hope springs eternal.
Fair enough. I'm fairly sure that you're wrong, but I won't say never. But it needs to be something better than a fancy argument. Thank you, Teddi. This has been a pleasant conversation. Probably of all the interactions that we've had, both by voice and by typing, this has been the most pleasant. So
absolutely.
So thank you for that. Dear listeners, I hope you've enjoyed this conversation as much as we've had. If you were hoping for fireworks, I'm sorry to disappoint you. If there's anything from this conversation, especially the last couple of minutes, by all means, get in touch. Let's carry on these conversations, because my position is that Christians need to engage exers. They need to engage those like me who have deconverted. They need to understand their place and where we fit into the story of Christianity and religion. Thank you again, Teddi. And
thank you. And it was great talking with you. Thank you.
You have been listening to a podcast by Reason Press. To get in touch, email reasonpress@gmail.com or see our website, reasonpress.net, where you'll also find our book, Still Unbelievable. We welcome more feedback, and you might even end up on an episode. Our theme music was written for us by Holly. You can hear more of her music at soundcloud.com/hollybishop. You can support us by buying some of Holly's music and telling her we sent you.